Imagine boarding a luxurious cruise, expecting days of relaxation and fun, only to discover that the real destination was absolute terror. When the fog descended and shadows began to move on their own, you realized something sinister inhabited that ship. Unexplained disappearances, whispered voices in the dark, and secrets buried deep in the ocean turned the dream vacation into an inescapable nightmare. Welcome to the horror lurking in every corner of this cursed ship, a disturbing true story. On a luxurious cruise where every detail was designed to provide an unforgettable experience, the soft evening light painted the sky with shades of orange and pink as Carlos and Julia, a couple seeking to reconnect their marriage, settled onto the balcony of their cabin. Julia closed her eyes, feeling the sea breeze caress her face, while Carlos smiled, believing they had finally found the break they so desperately needed. The sound of waves gently crashing against the ship's hull was almost hypnotic. In the corridors, the laughter of other passengers, like Ana, a young woman traveling alone to find herself, and Mr. Rodriguez, a recently widowed elderly man seeking peace, echoed as everyone eagerly anticipated a week of pure indulgence and relaxation. This cruise had been sold as a floating paradise, a unique opportunity to escape routine and surrender to luxury. Carlos and Julia could hardly wait to enjoy the sparkling pools, gourmet dinners, and parties under the stars. Everything seemed perfect. But sometimes, what seems like a dream can quickly turn into a nightmare. Ana, with her adventurous spirit, and Mr. Rodriguez, with his life stories, also had no idea what awaited them. What no one told them was that, far out at sea, far from any help, the darkest secrets could emerge from the depths. Carlos felt an unexpected shiver, while Julia noticed a shadow pass from the corner of her eye, but they convinced themselves it was just fatigue. Ana, on the other hand, began to feel an unsettling presence that seemed to follow her through the empty corridors, and Mr. Rodriguez started to realize that it wasn't just the memories of his late wife haunted him. Night fell, and the dream cruise for Carlos, Julia, Ana, and Mr. Rodriguez was about to reveal its true face. They had already embarked on this journey, and returning might not be possible. The first night on board passed peacefully, or at least it seemed so. Carlos and Julia, still enchanted by the surroundings, decided to explore the ship. On the deck, they found Ana, the young woman traveling alone, taking photos of the horizon. They exchanged a few words, but there was something in Ana's eyes, a restlessness that Carlos noticed, chose to ignore. Perhaps it was just the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar place. While they talked, Mr. Rodriguez approached. He seemed lost in thought, joined the group, drawn by the familiarity of other passengers. He commented on how cruises had changed over the years, but quickly changed the subject when something or someone in the distance caught his attention. He squinted, trying to focus on a solitary figure at the end of the deck. There, standing almost like a shadow merged with the darkness of the night, was a man no one had seen board. His clothes looked old-fashioned, as if they belonged to another era. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, but there was something disturbing in the way he stood still, as if he were waiting or watching. Carlos felt growing discomfort and, on impulse, approached the man to greet him. But as soon as he got close, the man turned, and Carlos noticed that his face was pale, almost lifeless, his eyes empty, as if they were looking through him at something beyond. A weak voice, almost a whisper, escaped the stranger's lips. "Not everything you're looking for here is what it seems. Be careful." Before Carlos could respond, the man slowly walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Julia, Ana, and Mr. Rodriguez watched, not understanding what had just happened. Something changed in the ship's atmosphere. The easy laughter of the first moments gave way to a tense silence. They didn't know what to expect. That night, none of them slept peacefully. Cruise, which was supposed to be an escape from their problems, was now beginning to reveal its own mystery. And that mysterious figure, that man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, was just the beginning. The next morning arrived with a thick fog that enveloped the ship, turning the surrounding ocean into an impenetrable blanket of white. Carlos woke up feeling uneasy, still disturbed by the encounter the previous night. Julia, beside him, seemed to have slept poorly, her dreams agitated by images she couldn't clearly remember. They dressed in silence, exchanging worried glances, but without mentioning the mysterious man they had met. At breakfast, the atmosphere in the dining room was strange. Passengers were quieter, as if something invisible hung in the air. Anna, usually so curious and lively, sat withdrawn in her corner, her eyes fixed on an untouched cup of coffee. Mr. Rodriguez, sitting alone at a nearby table, leafed through an old newspaper he had brought with him, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. Suddenly a commotion erupted on the other side of the room. A group of ship staff hurried to the exit, exchanging worried whispers. Carlos watched intently and realized something was wrong. He stood up and approached, followed by Julia. When they arrived at the scene, they found a pale, sweating employee trying to explain the situation. One of the passengers had disappeared. Marta, an elderly woman traveling with her daughter and grandchildren, had not returned to her cabin the previous night. Her daughter, in a panic, said the last time she saw her was near the deck, just before the fog appeared. Search began at dawn. So far, there was no sign of her anywhere. Carlos felt a chill down his spine. He remembered the man he had seen the previous night and the warning he had received. Julia clutched his hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear. As the other passengers began to whisper theories and speculations, Carlos noticed something even more disturbing. The ship, which should have been sailing in calm waters, now seemed lost. The fog was so dense that not even the horizon was visible. The ocean, once reassuring, had now become a prison of mystery. Anna, who had remained silent until then, suddenly stood up and approached Carlos and Julia. "I saw something last night," he whispered, her voice trembling. "When I was heading to my cabin, I felt like I was being followed, but when I turned around, there was no one there, just the sound of the waves and distant laughter." Marta's disappearance was not an isolated incident. Something much more sinister was happening on this cruise, and Carlos, Julia, Anna, and Mr. Rodriguez were beginning to realize that, on this ship, no one was safe. And as the fog thickened, the sense of dread only grew. As the fog became even thicker, the ship seemed to be sailing in a limbo between the real and the unknown. The day passed slowly, with the passengers trapped in a kind of torpor, as if something were draining their vitality. Carlos and Julia couldn't stop thinking about Marta's disappearance, and the strange presence of that man continued to haunt their thoughts. That night, the silence on the ship was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of the waves and the occasional creak of the structure. Carlos decided that he could no longer ignore what was happening. He, Julia, Anna, and Mr. Rodriguez met in the lounge, away from the curious eyes of the other passengers. They shared stories, each revealing the strange occurrences they had experienced since the beginning of the trip. Anna mentioned again the laughter she had heard the previous night, and Mr. Rodriguez, with a somber look, spoke of a constant feeling of being watched, even when he was alone. Julia confessed that she had been dreaming of figures emerging from the fog, pale faces and lifeless eyes that stared at her with an expression of pain and despair. Carlos, struggling to stay calm, shared his encounter with the mysterious man and the warning he had received. As they talked, a faint, almost imperceptible knock echoed through the room. They froze. The sound seemed to come from all sides, reverberating through the walls. Carlos stood up, trying to locate the source, but the knocking continued, persistent, as if it were coming from inside the ship itself. Suddenly, a child's voice, weak and full of sadness, filled the air. "Mommy, why did you leave?" Anna jumped, her eyes wide with horror. The voice didn't belong to anyone there, but it seemed so close, so real. Julia felt a shiver run down her spine, while Mr. Rodriguez whispered a prayer to himself. The knocking stopped as abruptly as it had started, and the silence that followed was even more suffocating. They knew they were no longer alone. Something, or someone, was trying to communicate with them. But whatever it wasn't of this world. Carlos approached the window and, with his heart racing, pulled back the curtain. The fog was so dense that he couldn't see anything beyond a white, opaque mass. But as he watched, a figure began to slowly emerge from the fog, as if it were walking directly on the water. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by long, wet hair, and her eyes were the same ones Julia had seen in her dreams. The figure drew closer to the ship, her presence almost tangible. and Carlos felt a wave of fear wash over him. Before he could react, the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, swallowed by the fog. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen remained. They were being hunted, and the ship, shrouded in fog, was the perfect hunting ground. Tension on board was palpable, and every step taken through the ship's corridors echoed like a sinister warning. Carlos, Julia, Ana, and Mr. Rodriguez felt that time was running out. They needed to discover what was happening before someone else disappeared. They decided to investigate the bowels of the ship, where they believed the answers might be hidden. Descending through the dimly lit corridors, they felt the air grow heavier, almost suffocating. The ship, once a place of luxury and comfort, now seemed like a claustrophobic labyrinth, each corner hiding something they preferred not to see. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional reverberation of the metal, as if the ship were breathing. In the hold, where the air was dense and smelled of rust, they found an old door, different from any other on the ship. The wood was dark, aged, with deep scratch marks, as if someone had desperately tried to escape. With his heart in his throat, Carlos turned the knob, which creaked under the pressure, and the door slowly opened, revealing a small, stuffy room. Inside, they found something that shouldn't have been there. Piles of yellowed papers, old records, and a wall covered in photos. Julia cautiously approached, examining the images. They were faces of people, passengers from other times, all with expressions of fear or despair. Among the photos, she recognized the face of the woman Carlos had seen in the fog and who she herself had dreamed about. Ana began to leaf through the papers, which revealed a dark truth. This ship should have been a symbol of pleasure and escape, while the past filled with tragedies. Decades ago, a series of unexplained disappearances had occurred on previous cruises, all mysteriously linked to this vessel. The stories had been hushed up, the records hidden. Now they were facing the reality that had been buried. Mr. Rodriguez, with a panicked look, recognized a name in the documents. It was the same name the mysterious man had whispered to Carlos on that first night. He remembered old stories, curses associated with the sea, of souls that never found peace and that haunted those who dared to invade their domain. D toward them, as if watching them. Carlos, struggling against the rising panic, realized that they were not alone in that hold. There was a presence there, an entity that didn't want to be disturbed. And that presence was approaching. The air in the ship's hold became unbearably heavy, almost as if it were difficult to breathe. Carlos, Julia, Ana, and Mr. Rodriguez felt the panic rising, but it was too late to retreat. The entity that inhabited that ship wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The shadows on the walls seemed to move distorted, as if they were alive, dancing to a music only they could hear. Suddenly, an invisible force pushed Carlos against the wall, knocking the wind out of him. Julia screamed, trying to help him, but something stopped her. Cold pressure on her chest that paralyzed her. Ana, trembling, grabbed Mr. Rodriguez's arm, but he didn't react. His gaze was fixed on something in the center of the room, a void where the darkness seemed denser. Then she appeared. The woman Carlos had seen in the fog, who Julia had dreamed about and who was in the old photos, materialized out of nowhere, her translucent body floating in the air. Her eyes were fixed on them, and her expression was one of pure pain and anger. She no longer belonged to this world, but her presence was as real as theirs, and she wanted revenge. With a voice that echoed like a whisper in everyone's mind, she began to tell her story. She was a passenger on a cruise many years ago, a trip that was supposed to be her last attempt at happiness. Something went horribly wrong. She was betrayed, left to die, and her spirit never found peace. Since then, she had roamed that ship, dragging with her any soul unlucky enough to cross her path. As she spoke, the temperature in the room plummeted. The vapor of her words was visible in the icy air, and Carlos, still pinned against the wall, felt despair take hold. He realized they were just the latest in a long line of victims. The ship was a floating cemetery, cursed by the pain and suffering of so many who came before. Julia tried to speak, to beg for their lives, but the entity wasn't interested in negotiating. Her gaze fixed on Ana, who suddenly fell to her knees, clutching her head as if it were being crushed by an invisible force. Mr. Rodriguez tried to run, but the doors slammed shut with a loud bang, trapping them inside the hold. There was no escape. The ghostly woman gave one last look of pure hatred before dissolving into the darkness, but her presence continued to fill the space, growing more oppressive by the second. And then silence. A silence so deep it seemed to absorb all sound from the outside world. It was in that silence that the true nature of the ship was revealed. The walls began to bleed, dark, viscous liquid that smelled of death. The shadows, now very real, began to stretch toward them, wanting to pull them into the depths. Carlos, finally freed from the force that held him, desperately tried to open the door, but it was useless. They were trapped. Julia and Ana cried, and Mr. Rodriguez, in shock, merely muttered prayers. For a moment, they all saw a large amount of water seep through the cracks in the doors. They all fought for their lives except for Mr. Rodriguez, who chose to sit in a lone chair, forgotten in the corner of the room, as if accepting his fate. The others couldn't believe what was happening. They were desperately trying to find a way out, sometimes praying, sometimes trying to open the doors. And with the water now reaching their knees, Mr. Rodriguez fainted, believing this was his end and that he was on his way to meet his recently deceased wife. If this story has captivated you and you want more like it, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. Don't miss any details of what's to come. The next morning, he awoke in his cabin, called by the same child's voice he had heard earlier, with his clothes dry and clean. For a moment, he tried to remember the previous night, but his memory faded at the moment he fainted. He whispered in lament, "Sorry, Fatima. It wasn't time for our reunion yet." He left his cabin and headed to the dining room where he believed he would find the others, but he found no clues, asked all the ship's staff, and none had even seen these passengers before. Mr. Rodriguez was convinced that the previous night had been a living nightmare and nothing more. Hours later, after trying to find the others, he decided to go to the captain and ask for the passenger list. He wasn't old enough not to know how to separate reality from imagination. But in the passenger list, there were no people with the names he had mentioned. The next morning, he awoke in his cabin, called by the same child's voice he had heard earlier, with his clothes dry and clean. For a moment, he tried to remember the previous night, but his memory faded at the moment he fainted. He whispered in lament, "Sorry, Fatima. It wasn't time for our reunion yet." He left his cabin and headed to the dining room where he believed he would find the others. But he found no clues, asked all the ship's staff, and none had even seen these passengers before. Mr. Rodriguez was convinced that the previous night had been a living nightmare and nothing more. Hours later, after trying to find the others, he decided to go to the captain and ask for the passenger list. He wasn't old enough not to know how to separate reality from imagination, but in the passenger list there were no people with the names he had mentioned. As he walked toward the ballroom, determined to take a shot of any alcoholic drink that would allow him to forget or understand what was happening, he noticed that the ballroom walls were adorned with photographs from all the previous cruises' balls. Passionate about photography, he began looking at them one by one, trying to distract himself from the feeling of fear, doubt, and pain plagued his heart. Until in a photo of a special inauguration ball for the cruise dated 1946, he saw the other passengers who had been with him the previous night. He looked and looked again, but he was certain of what he was seeing. They were there, without a doubt. In the photo was also a woman he had seen before, as well as a child. These images now echoed in Mr. Rodriguez's mind, until a small, icy hand grabbed his and whispered in a sad and lonely voice, "I saw your heart, and out of respect for your granddaughter, I will let you leave this ship alive. Live happy moments with her, never abandon her like my mother did to me, and if you ever fail to do these things, I will find you, and your destiny will be to accompany me for eternity. Keep our secret. Never tell anyone. Do you agree to these terms?" Without a second thought, he nodded yes, and as if by magic, the child disappeared, leaving a small cut on Mr. Rodriguez's finger, as if to leave a reminder, a blood pact, and proof that what he had lived was real. In the end, Mr. Rodriguez spent the rest of his days in his cabin, disembarked at the port, and went straight to meet his granddaughter. He lived for another 13 years until he suddenly died in his sleep, leaving behind only a letter among his belongings, in which he recounted everything that had happened on that ship. The ship, in silence, continued its journey across the ocean, carrying with it more lost souls. The sea kept its secrets, and those who were lost would never be found. What happened to the initial passengers? What triggered this curse? Perhaps we will never know. Do you have any guesses? Leave them in the comments. If you enjoy stories that leave you on the edge of panic, that make your heart race and make you look over your shoulder even when the lights are on, you're in the right place. Every story we tell here is a journey into the unknown, a deep dive into your worst nightmares. Real accounts, disturbing and macabre stories are waiting for you. If you're brave enough to continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, the next story might be scarier than the last. And believe me, you won't want to miss a thing. So get ready for more mysteries, more terror, and remember, on our channel, fear is the only guaranteed passenger. Welcome to the darkest side of the human mind.